There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a lie has just been told to someone who already knows the truth. I have spent most of my adult life learning to recognize that silence, learning to sit inside it without moving, without speaking, without letting anything surface in my expression that might warn the liar they have miscalculated. It is not a comfortable skill. It requires a specific variety of patience, not the patience of a man who is waiting for something to arrive, but the patience of a man who knows it is already here. The morning the Joint Treaty Commission voted to erase Earth's diplomatic record, I was sitting in the observer gallery on the north tier of the commission chamber. 42 rows back from the floor, with a thermos of cold coffee and a leather satchel that contained, among other things, 11 years of their decisions. I did not move. I did not speak. I watched the vote proceed, watched the commission clerk announce the result in the flat, procedural tone those clerks cultivate as a professional virtue, and I watched the small amber indicator beside the word Earth in the commission's master registry dim from active to void. It took perhaps 4 seconds. 11 years of accredited observation, terminated in the time it takes to exhale. Then I poured another cup of cold coffee and waited for the session to continue. My name is Marin Voss. At the time of the vote, I held a rank that no longer officially existed, third analyst, Special Liaison Division, Earth Diplomatic Service, and a credential that the Commission had just declared invalid retroactively to the date of my original accreditation. In the Commission's records, I had never been in that chamber. I was, as of the amber light going out, a ghost, a piece of administrative fiction that the Commission had quietly decided to stop maintaining. What the Commission did not know, and what I had spent 11 years ensuring they would not know, was that I had been keeping a second record. Not a shadow archive in any romantic sense. No secret vault, no encrypted courier drops, nothing that would invite the kind of attention a shadow archive invites. Just meticulous, patient, daily documentation of everything that passed through or adjacent to the commission floor. Every vote tally, every procedural amendment, every side corridor exchange that I had positioned myself to overhear or observe, every document that crossed my desk through the access I held as a formally accredited observer. All of it filed in a system that existed on hardware I controlled and maintained personally, routed through channels that I am not going to describe in any detail, because some of those channels are still in use. I had begun the project without a clear sense of what it was for. That is the honest answer. I was 29 years old, freshly posted to the commission at the tail end of a career track that had taken me through 2 field assignments and 1 very quiet operation that I am still not permitted to discuss. And I was the only human being with formal standing in a chamber that contained representatives of 41 sovereign species and governed a treaty framework covering roughly 1/3 of mapped space. My predecessor in the role, a career diplomat named Calloway, had been politely declined reaccreditation 8 years before my arrival. Before him, a woman named Threskin had held the seat for 19 months before the commission restructured its observer rules in a way that made her credentials non-compliant. Before her, the seat had been vacant for 6 years. The pattern was not difficult to read, even for a 29-year-old. What the pattern told me was that Earth's presence in the commission was tolerated at a specific controlled depth, and that depth had a ceiling. Observers could watch. Observers could file reports. Observers could, in theory, speak during the designated open comment periods at the end of each session, which in practice lasted between 3 and 7 minutes and occurred at the end of days that had already run for 9 or 10 hours. What observers could not do was vote. What observers could not do was propose amendments. What observers could not do was demand recusal of a commission member on grounds of conflict of interest, even if that conflict was documented, and the documentation was on record with the commission secretariat. None of these rules were written down in those terms. The commission's charter was a thing of remarkable elegance. It said all the right things about equal standing, mutual recognition, and the inviolable right of any accredited member to full participation in the Commission's proceedings. The gap between what the Charter said and what the Charter permitted in practice was the Commission's greatest achievement, in my estimation. It had taken them centuries to build that gap, and they maintained it with the care of a master craftsman. I had been in the chamber for 3 weeks before I began to understand the gap. I had been there for 3 months before I understood its architecture. I had been there for a year before I concluded that the most useful thing I could do, perhaps the only useful thing, was to document it. The decision did not feel significant when I made it. It felt like the choice of someone who has run out of other options and has settled with some resignation on the one that at least produces something. I told no one. There was no one to tell who would have found the information useful. My reporting chain at the service was focused on outcomes, on what the Commission was deciding and what Earth's posture in response to those decisions should be. And the granular, patient accumulation of procedural documentation was not an outcomes report. I filed my standard observer summaries as required, and I kept the second record on my own time, on my own hardware, as a personal project that might someday become operationally relevant, or might simply become the most detailed description of the Commission's internal workings that any human being had ever compiled. Either outcome seemed worth the effort. So I did. 11 years is a long time to be patient. I will not pretend it was easy or that I never considered other approaches. There were nights in my quarters in the Commission's attached residence block when the accumulated weight of what I had watched that day made sitting still feel like a physical discipline, something requiring active muscular effort. There were votes I watched pass by margins of 3 or 4, votes that would have gone the other way if the human seat had carried full standing, that I filed carefully in my record and then did not think about again until morning, because thinking about them at night served no operational purpose. The Commission's working day had its own rhythm, and I had learned that rhythm the way you learn any complex recurring system, not by studying it abstractly, but by moving through it every day for years until the anomalies started to stand out against the regular pattern the way a wrong note stands out in a melody you know. The regular pattern was procedural, formal, often slow. 41 delegations meant 41 sets of institutional priorities, communication styles, internal hierarchies, and procedural preferences. The Commission floor session was rarely where decisions happened. The floor session was where decisions were announced, framed, and recorded. The actual decisions happened in committee rooms, in corridor conversations, in the dining facilities on the Commission's 3rd floor, where delegations that had been working together for decades sat at their habitual tables and spoke in the shorthand of people who had long since stopped needing to explain context to each other. My daily documentation process was unglamorous in the extreme, and I think that was the essential thing about it. There was no drama in the practice, only repetition, which is the enemy of attention in other people and the foundation of accuracy in the person doing the repeating. Every morning I reviewed the Commission's published schedule for the day, compared it against my own running assessment of which agenda items were likely proxies for decisions that had been made elsewhere, and made a note of the discrepancies. Every evening I wrote up what I had observed during the day in the same format I had used since the 2nd month of my posting. Time, location, what I saw or heard, who was present, source quality, confidence level. The format had not changed in 11 years, because changing it would have created a period of inconsistency in the record. And I had decided early on that consistency of format was worth the minor rigidity it imposed. A record built in a single, consistent methodology is easier to defend than a record built in several successive methodologies, even if the later ones are better. I reviewed the record quarterly and annually, looking for patterns that were not visible at the daily or weekly scale. This was the part of the work that I found genuinely absorbing, in the way that any long-run observation task becomes absorbing once you have enough data to begin seeing structure in it. The Commission's decision-making patterns had a shape. That shape had sub-patterns, the ways specific coalitions formed around specific categories of issue, the predictable calendar dynamics that governed when certain kinds of procedural moves became more likely, the correlation between specific combinations of delegations being seated together in the pre-session waiting area, and certain outcomes on the floor later that day. None of this was conclusive. All of it was documented, and the documentation of patterns is what makes the appearance of an anomaly legible. You cannot see a deviation from a norm you haven't established. The 11 years of daily observation were, in part, the establishment of that norm. Getting access to that layer of the Commission's operation was not a matter of covert technique. It was a matter of becoming, over time, unremarkable. A human observer with a valid credential was an unusual presence at the Commission, but it was not an unprecedented or especially alarming one. Earth had held observer status in one form or another for nearly 3 decades, and the Commission's institutional memory of that status had the faint, untroubled quality of something that has never been relevant enough to worry about. I was the latest in a line of observers. I filed my reports, I attended my sessions, I submitted my routine access requests and my standard observer communications. I said good morning to the Commission staff I encountered in the corridors. I ate lunch in the third-floor dining facility, at a table in the northeast corner that I had chosen, because its position gave me sight lines to 4 other tables and proximity to 2 corridor junctions, and I ate there every working day for 11 years. It is remarkable what people will say within 6 feet of someone they have decided is not worth noticing. I kept notes. I kept them in the most boring format available, a running observational log filed under the observer's standard activity reporting heading, which was a category of document the Commission's administrative system automatically archived without review, because it had never in the Commission's institutional history contained anything of consequence. I had read, in my first year at the Commission, a retrospective study of observer station documentation practices that had been published by the Commission's own research office 40 years prior. The study concluded that observer activity reports were the single least consulted category of archived Commission document. I noted this and began using the format accordingly. There were a number of exchanges in side corridors and Commission anteroom spaces that I was not supposed to have witnessed, but did, because I had spent considerable effort learning which routes through the Commission complex gave a person with an observer badge access to the places where the Commission's actual decisions were made, as opposed to the places where those decisions were subsequently announced. The Commission building was a large, complex structure that had been expanded several times over the decades of its operation. The expansion history meant that its corridor and access systems had accumulated, over time, a set of structural irregularities, junctions where 2 wings met at angles not well served by direct routes, service corridors that connected spaces on the building's map that were not connected by the building's primary circulation routes, a network of maintenance access points that the building's facilities management used for their daily operations. These were not secrets. The building schematics were available in the Commission's facilities documentation. I had read them in my second month at the Commission as part of a general orientation effort, and I had continued to consult them over subsequent years as the occasion arose. If I moved through the building in ways that were slightly less predictable than a standard observer's movements, I attributed that, when the question was ever raised, to the fact that I had been posted there long enough to know the building well. The question was rarely raised. The Anchuret Compact had been in development for 4 years before the Commission brought it to a ratification vote. I had known it was coming for 3 of those 4 years, because 4 years before the ratification vote I had been positioned, through a combination of circumstance and planning, to overhear a preliminary discussion between Commission Chair Harath Vaughn and the senior Keldrath delegate in a corridor outside the second-floor committee rooms. They were not being careless. They were speaking in the Keldrath trade dialect, which is not widely known among non-Keldrath species, and which I had spent 14 months learning during my second year at the Commission, because the Keldrath delegation's proximity to the chair was a structural fact about the Commission that seemed worth understanding in depth. Keldrath is not a simple language to acquire. It is structured around a system of tonal distinctions that do not map onto standard Commission dialect phonology, and its formal and commercial registers are different enough from each other that functional competency in one does not automatically extend to the other. I had learned it from two sources: a language program produced by the Keldrath Scholastic Exchange, which I had obtained through the Commission's library access, and a Keldrath junior delegation staffer named Soveth Mar, who had been posted to the Commission 2 years into my tenure, and who had agreed, after several months of lunch-table acquaintance, to help me work through the trade dialect's more technically demanding features in exchange for assistance with the formal Commission dialect's procedural vocabulary, which non-native Commission dialect speakers often found opaque. Soveth Mar had left the Commission posting after another 2 years, transferred to a domestic assignment, and we had exchanged occasional professional correspondence since. She had no knowledge of what I had done with the language she taught me, and I had no intention of telling her. What I heard that evening in the corridor outside the second-floor committee rooms was a relatively brief exchange, perhaps 4 minutes, about the terms of the Compact's resource allocation provisions, specifically the sections governing transit rights through the Anchoret Corridor, which is a navigational passage of considerable strategic value connecting the Commission's inner sphere to the outer reach territories. The Anchoret Corridor was not a new point of contention. It had appeared in Commission documentation for decades, subject to a series of prior agreements and sub-agreements that had each addressed portions of the transit question without resolving it. The question of comprehensive transit governance had been deferred, repeatedly, for reasons that the Commission's public record described as procedural complexity. The supplementary record I had been building for 6 years described the same deferrals somewhat differently. The exchange was courteous, even warm. The chair and the Keldrath senior delegate had the easy familiarity of people who had been doing business together for a long time. They discussed the transit provisions with the comfortable specificity of people who had already decided what those provisions would say, and were now working out the administrative detail of how to present the decision as the outcome of an open deliberative process. Earth had 3 registered commercial transit claims in the Anchoret Corridor. None of them were mentioned. I went back to my quarters that evening and documented the exchange in full, time, location, direct quotation in the original dialect, my own translation, contextual notes. Then I cross-referenced it against the 6 years of prior Commission documentation in which the Keldrath delegation's relationship to the chair's office appeared as a variable, and I began building a supplementary file on the Compact specifically. That supplementary file grew, over the following 3 years, to several thousand pages. I want to be precise about what was in it, because precision is the only thing that makes a record useful. It was not a file of speculation. It was not a file of interpretation or argument or editorial. It was a file of documented fact, times, locations, sources, direct quotation where available, observed behavior where direct quotation was not available, and careful, labeled separation between what I had directly witnessed or recorded and what I had inferred from documented evidence. Every inference was marked as an inference. Every gap in the chain was marked as a gap. I had been trained to build records that could survive cross-examination by a hostile party, and I built this one accordingly. The Commission had a compact deliberation committee that met every 3 weeks for the first 2 years of the compact's development, and monthly thereafter. I attended every open session of this committee as an accredited observer. I submitted observer comment requests for 11 of the sessions, using the standard comment protocol. Comments from the observer gallery were acknowledged in the committee's minutes in a standard form that noted the comment's source and general subject, without paraphrase or quotation. In the committee's official minutes, the 11 comments I had submitted were recorded as Observer VOS, Earth, Subject, Transit Allocation Provisions. This was accurate. What the minutes did not record was the content of those comments, which is standard committee practice, or the fact that none of those comments had received any response from the committee or its supporting staff at any point during the compact's development process, which is also, as it turns out, standard committee practice. I noted this each time in my supplementary file, under the heading Institutional Response Record, Compact Deliberation Committee. The heading ran to 11 entries by the time the committee's work concluded. What the file documented in summary was the following. The Anchorage Compact was not the outcome of the Commission's open deliberative process. It was the outcome of a negotiation that had been conducted privately between the Chair's office and a coalition of 7 delegations over a period of approximately 4 years, before the Compact's terms were finalized, and the open deliberative process was then run as a formality. The open deliberative process produced no substantive changes to the Compact's terms. The 7-delegation coalition controlled enough votes to ratify the Compact without requiring any additional support. 3 of the species whose transit interests in the Anchorage corridor were directly affected by the Compact's allocation provisions had not been consulted during the private negotiation. Earth was one of them. The other 2 were the Varath Sovereignty and the Ondrath Collective, both of whom held navigational claims in the corridor's outer reaches. The Varath Sovereignty maintained a commission observer seat of their own, though the seat's accreditation status had been similarly managed over the years in ways I had documented in my main record. The Ondrath Collective did not have a commission presence at all. They were a smaller body, recently unified, whose formal commission recognition was itself a pending matter that had been pending, I noted, for the same 4 years during which the Compact had been in private development. Their corridor claims existed in the treaty record, but had never been formally adjudicated. The Commission's handling of the Ondrath recognition application was a minor masterpiece of procedural stasis. The application had been filed correctly and completely. It met the Commission's stated criteria for consideration. It had been assigned to a review subcommittee that had met twice in 4 years, both times to defer consideration pending the receipt of additional documentation, and had both times specified the documentation in terms that required the Ondrath Collective to access archives held by a Commission member delegation that had not responded to the Collective's access requests. I had documented all of this. The pattern of the Ondrath application was not identical to Earth's pattern of managed exclusion, but it rhymed with it, the same grammar of process used to produce the same result, in a slightly different institutional register. Institutions that have learned to use procedure as a tool do not use it only once. None of this was illegal under the Commission's charter. That was the elegant part. The Commission's charter required open deliberation. It did not define what counted as deliberation. It required that affected parties be given the opportunity to comment. It did not require that comments have any effect on the outcome. It required that all accredited observers have access to Commission proceedings. It did not require that observer access extend to the committee rooms where the proceedings' actual substance was determined. The gap was holding. The vote to erase Earth's diplomatic record was the Commission's solution to a problem that had emerged 2 weeks before the ratification vote was scheduled. The problem was procedural. Specifically, one of the three non-consulted species whose transit interests were affected by the compact's allocation provisions, had filed a formal standing challenge, a request for the Commission to recognize their delegations' direct standing in the ratification vote on grounds that the compact's terms materially affected their sovereign territory. This was the Varith sovereignty. They had engaged a Commission-specialized legal firm and filed the challenge through proper channels with careful preparation. The Commission had a mechanism for granting standing in these circumstances. It was rarely used, but it existed, and the Varith challenge was technically sound. If the standing challenge succeeded, the Varith delegation would gain a voting seat for the ratification session, and the coalition's margin would become uncertain. More importantly, if one standing challenge succeeded, the Andrath Collective would have grounds to file their own, and the precedent would be clean and recent. Earth's diplomatic service had filed a standing challenge on behalf of our transit claims 8 months prior, before the Varith filing, before any of this had become a visible procedural problem for the Commission. We had not received a response. What the Commission did instead was simpler and cleaner. They convened an emergency administrative session 2 weeks before the ratification vote, during which the Commission's Secretariat presented a procedural review of observer accreditation records. The review identified several instances of noncompliance with the Commission's updated credential verification protocols that had been updated 3 months prior, in a revision to the administrative rules that had been noticed in a single line in the Commission's published bulletin. Earth's accreditation, the review found, was non-compliant on 2 grounds: a documentation filing that had been submitted in an older form standard, and a residency verification for my own posted status that had not been updated following a change of Commission residence rules. The filings existed. I had submitted them. The form standard change and the residence rule change had both occurred after the filings were submitted. Neither the Secretariat nor the Commission's Accreditation Office had notified me that the filings were now non-compliant, as the administrative rules required. None of this was mentioned in the review. The Commission voted, 19-4 with 3 abstentions, to suspend Earth's accreditation pending a full remediation process, and to void Earth's accreditation retroactively to the date of the non-compliant filings, which the Secretariat had determined to be 14 months prior to the session. The retroactive voiding was the functional point of the exercise. If my accreditation was void for the prior 14 months, then my standing challenge, filed 8 months prior, was void along with it. There was no standing challenge. There was no pending administrative response required. The Commission's record was clean. The Varith challenge was addressed separately in the same session, through a different administrative mechanism, a procedural finding that the Varith sovereignty's legal firm lacked proper Commission authorization to file on their behalf, and that the filing was therefore procedurally defective. It would need to be refiled. The refiling window, under the Commission's procedural rules, could not be completed before the ratification vote's scheduled date. The Andrath Collective had not yet filed. After the administrative session, there was nothing left for them to join. I sat in the observer gallery and watched this happen. I was not removed from the gallery during the session, because the gallery was technically a public space, and removing me would have required a separate procedural step that the Commission had apparently not planned for. No one looked at me directly. The Commission clerk announced the result. The amber light beside the word Earth went out. I poured cold coffee and waited. The ratification vote for the Anchoret Compact was scheduled for the following morning. It would be, procedurally, a brief session. The chair would open, the clerk would call the vote, the coalition would ratify, the chair would adjourn. An hour, perhaps 2 if there were formalities. The Commission's press office had already distributed a draft of the ratification announcement to the diplomatic correspondents who covered the Commission beat, which I knew because, One of those correspondents was a contact I had been cultivating for 7 years, and had spoken with 48 hours before the administrative session. That evening, I sent a secure message to the Earth Diplomatic Services Regional Coordination Office. The message was brief. It contained a file reference number and a time. It said, "Send the delegation." I want to be clear about what I was doing when I sent that message. I was not improvising. I was not acting in anger or from any sudden decision. The message was the last step in a sequence I had begun planning approximately 3 years earlier, when I had concluded, based on the trajectory of what I was documenting, that there was a specific category of scenario for which I needed to have a prepared response ready, and that the prepared response needed to be positioned well in advance of the scenario actually occurring. The scenario I had planned for was this. The Commission would at some point move to eliminate Earth's formal standing before a vote on something that materially affected Earth's interests. When they did, the elimination would be conducted through process rather than direct action, an administrative mechanism, a paperwork deficiency, a compliance review. It would be quiet. It would be deniable. And it would be time to preclude any meaningful response. The prepared response I had developed was not a protest. It was not a legal challenge, though a legal challenge would follow in due course. It was not a speech or a statement or a formal objection, because I had spent 11 years watching speeches, statements, and formal objections accomplish nothing in a room where the people receiving them had already decided the outcome. The prepared response was the second record. I arrived at the Commission chamber the following morning 40 minutes before the ratification session was scheduled to open. The gallery was already filling. Ratification of a compact governing Anchurit corridor transit rights was a significant event, and the diplomatic community that orbited the Commission had turned out accordingly. I took my usual seat, 42 rows back, north tier. My leather satchel was on my lap. Inside it was a portable projection and transmission unit, powered independently, with a secure uplink to the coordination network the Earth Diplomatic Service maintained for Commission-adjacent operations. The unit was approximately the size of a standard document folio. I had cleared it through the Commission building's security screening that morning without difficulty, because it was classified in the security system as a standard document folio. At the time I arrived, my accreditation was still void. The amber indicator was still dark. I was still in the Commission's record a ghost. The session opened precisely on schedule. Chair Herath Vaughn took her position at the head of the Commission floor. The delegations settled into their seats. The clerk began the formal opening protocol. The gallery was quiet in the particular way galleries are quiet when everyone is paying close attention. I let the opening protocol run to completion. I let the chair call for any preliminary business, and watched 3 delegations rise to offer brief procedural courtesies, boilerplate statements of the kind that senior delegates offer when they want to be on record as having spoken before a historic vote. I let those statements conclude. Then I opened the satchel and placed the projection and transmission unit on the seat beside me and activated it. What the unit did, in the first 60 seconds after activation, was 2 things simultaneously. It transmitted a data package to 37 separate receiving addresses: the Diplomatic Press Corps, the Earth Diplomatic Services regional and home offices, 6 non-commissioned government entities whose interests were adjacent to the Anchurit corridor, the Varath Sovereignty's own diplomatic office, the Andrath Collective's government contact, and 3 independent archival institutions whose function is the preservation of interspecies diplomatic records. The package contained my complete supplementary file on the Anchurit Compact, organized as a formal evidentiary document with a table of contents, source citations, and a methodology statement explaining the record-keeping standards I had applied throughout. Simultaneously, it opened a projection in the air above the Commission floor. I had thought carefully about what to project. The supplementary file was thousands of pages. Even summarized, it was more than a session could usefully absorb. What I chose instead was a visual index, a structured display showing the Commission's official record of the compact's development, alongside a timeline of what my documentation showed had actually occurred, synchronized so that every point where the official record diverged from the documented reality was marked with a reference number keyed to the specific pages in the transmitted package. Each reference number corresponded to a primary source in the archive, an audio recording, a dated document, an observed exchange with time and location and source notation. It was not a presentation. It was a map. It was designed to be understood in approximately 4 minutes by anyone with working knowledge of the Commission's procedures, and to be impossible to dismiss as speculation or fabrication by anyone who chose to examine the underlying documentation. The projection filled roughly a third of the chamber's overhead space. It was visible from every seat on the floor. The Commission floor went silent. I have thought about that silence a great deal in the years since. It was different from the silence I described at the beginning, the silence of a room where a lie has been told to someone who already knows the truth. That silence is tense. It has the quality of something coiled. This silence was different. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just discovered that the question they were about to vote on was not the question they had thought it was. It was, I think, the silence of people recalibrating, running backward through their understanding of the prior 4 years, and adjusting it, item by item, against a new set of parameters. Herath Vaughn was the first to speak. She was a composed figure, the chair not warm, but not cold either. Someone who had spent decades managing large rooms of strong personalities and had developed, through that experience, a kind of controlled authority that expressed itself most visibly in her ability to respond to unexpected events without visible disruption. I had admired that quality from a professional standpoint for years. I admired it now, because the moment it took her to collect herself before speaking was genuinely brief. She said, in the standard Commission dialect that the floor used for official proceedings, "The observer gallery is not recognized during Commission floor sessions. Any materials being displayed from the observer gallery are in violation of Commission floor protocols and should be." She stopped. The sentence ended without completion, which was itself a notable event. In 11 years, I had never heard Herath Vaughn leave a sentence unfinished on the Commission floor. She had stopped because the projection was still active, and because the Keldreth senior delegate, who occupied a floor seat in the center of the chamber's primary arc, had just stood up. His name was Eshavar Tal, and he had been in that seat for longer than I had been in the observer gallery. He was not looking at the chair. He was looking at the projection. Specifically, he was looking at the section of the index that covered the corridor exchange I had documented 4 years earlier. The exchange between himself and Herath Vaughn that had occurred outside the second-floor committee rooms, in which they had discussed the compact's transit provisions with the comfortable specificity of people who had already decided what those provisions would say. I had not simply documented that exchange from memory. I had documented it with audio. The corridor outside the second-floor committee rooms had, at the time of the exchange, been equipped with a building environmental monitoring array that the Commission's facilities management used to regulate temperature, ventilation, and ambient noise levels. The array used a passive audio input system for its noise level monitoring function. The Commission's facilities management IT documentation, which was publicly available on the Commission's administrative intranet under a category heading I had located in my first year at the Commission, described the array's data retention policy as 72 hours for standard operating data, with extended retention enabled in proximity to designated sensitive spaces. The second-floor committee rooms were designated sensitive spaces. The extended retention period was 14 days. The monitoring array's data archive was accessible to accredited observers under the Commission's transparency provisions. Specifically, a subsection dealing with facility usage records that had been included in the transparency provisions during a charter revision 40 years earlier, as a concession during a dispute about commission building access for non-member delegations, and which had never subsequently been amended. I had submitted a formal access request for the monitoring array's audio data from the relevant date 18 months after the exchange. Under a facility usage inquiry, I had filed as part of a larger set of administrative inquiries I submitted periodically as a routine exercise of my observer access rights. The Commission's Facilities Management Office had provided the data without apparent awareness of its content. I had stored the audio in my secondary archive and had not referenced it again until I was building the supplementary files section on the compact's pre-deliberative development. The clip I had included in the visual index was 47 seconds long. It covered the most specific portion of the exchange, the portion in which Herath Von and Eshevar Tal discussed, by specific article number, the transit provision language they had agreed on, in a Keldrath trade dialect that neither of them would have expected any human observer to understand. Eshevar Tal was still standing. He had not said anything. He was looking at the projection with an expression I did not have a precise name for. It was not the panic expression that species wear when they are caught in an obvious violation and are calculating the cost of it. It was quieter than that. It was closer to the expression of someone who has just understood that the thing they believed was private has been, for a significant period of time, not private at all. He sat down slowly. He did not speak for the remainder of the session. Herath Von had recovered. She was addressing the floor in controlled, deliberate language, explaining that the materials being projected were unverified, and their source was an entity with no current standing in commission proceedings, and that the session would be recessed pending an administrative review of the situation. She was saying the right words in the right order. She was doing exactly what a skilled commission chair does when something has gone wrong in a public session. She was managing the procedural record. The language she was using was precise and contained. Unverified materials, no current standing, administrative review pending. She was building the response in real time, each word chosen to preserve the maximum possible room for the review process to conclude whatever the commission needed it to conclude. She was also not looking at me. I deactivated the projection unit and closed the satchel. The transmission had completed 9 minutes earlier. The data package was already at all 37 receiving addresses. Whatever the Commission's administrative review concluded about my standing, about the validity of my accreditation, about the propriety of the materials I had introduced, the documentation was no longer inside the Commission's control. There was a brief, difficult period on the floor between Herath Von's announcement of the recess and the actual dispersal of the delegations. Several delegates had questions, not directed to the chair, not directed to the gallery, but to their own immediate neighbors, in the low, urgent exchanges that begin at a moment like this when experienced political operators are all simultaneously trying to determine whether what they just saw changes anything they had already planned. I watched these exchanges from the gallery. I could not hear them. I did not need to. The body language was sufficient. Leaned heads, tight clusters, one delegate from a mid-arc delegation making a rapid note on the pad in front of her, another already consulting with a staff aide who had appeared at his shoulder from the corridor doors at the floor level. The session was suspended. The commission floor was becoming, in real time, 41 small, separate reconsidering operations. I sat quietly while the recess was called. I watched the floor clear, watched the delegations move toward the corridor exits in the particular clustered formations that form when a room full of experienced political operators are all simultaneously recalibrating. I watched the commission staff move with the efficient urgency of people who have been given a clear directive and are carrying it out. I watched 2 of the commission's security personnel enter the gallery at the north tier door and make their way toward my row, not quickly, not with any aggression, professionally, carefully, the way people are trained to approach a situation they have not been briefed on in full. I had my identification and my voided credential ready when they arrived. I presented both without being asked. One of them examined the credential and said, in a neutral voice, that they would need me to accompany them to the Commission's Administrative Security Office, and that it would be appreciated if I brought the case with me. I said I understood, and I picked up the satchel and I followed them out of the gallery. The 3 hours I spent in the Administrative Security Office were unremarkable from a narrative standpoint. I was seated in a room that was clean, adequately ventilated, and furnished with the functional minimalism that characterizes Commission facility spaces not intended for diplomatic use. I was offered water. I declined. I was informed by a Commission security official whose title was Deputy Compliance Director that my presence in the Commission building in the absence of valid accreditation constituted a protocol violation, and that the matter was being reviewed at the level of the Commission Secretariat. I acknowledged this. The Deputy Compliance Director then asked me whether I wished to make a statement regarding the materials I had introduced into the session. I told him that I did not wish to make a statement at this time, and that any further communication should be directed to the Earth Diplomatic Services Legal Counsel, whose contact information was in the documentation I had transmitted to the press corps, and which was therefore now publicly available. The Deputy Compliance Director wrote something down. There was a pause. He asked whether I would be remaining in the Commission's residential district while the review was pending. I told him that I had already arranged for my personal effects to be packed, and that I would be leaving the Commission compound that afternoon. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, carefully, that the Commission's review timeline was uncertain, and that it might be helpful to know whether I would be reachable. I told him that the Earth Diplomatic Service would know how to reach me. He wrote something else down, and then there was another pause, and then he said that I was free to go. I walked out of the Commission compound at mid-afternoon. The compound exits onto a wide, open paving plaza that stretches between the Commission's building complex and the transit hub that serves the diplomatic district. It was a clear day, the kind of flat, even light that the planet's climate produces in that season, without harsh shadow or strong directional angle. I had walked across that plaza several thousand times in 11 years. I had learned, in the way you learn things about physical spaces you inhabit for long periods, which sections of the paving had been replaced recently, and which were original, which lights in the Commission's exterior fascia had the occasional flicker, which direction the prevailing wind came from in each season. I crossed the plaza without looking back at the building. The Earth Diplomatic Service had arranged a transit vehicle at the hub. 2 of our people were waiting with it, a junior attaché I had worked with before named Pryor, and a senior legal officer named Daksha Ren, who had been working commission-related cases for the service for 20 years. Ren was carrying a briefing case and wearing the expression of someone who has spent the last several hours in rapid consultation and has reached a set of preliminary conclusions. She said, as I reached the vehicle, "The compact vote is suspended pending review. 37 correspondents have acknowledged receipt of the documentation. The standing challenge we filed 8 months ago has been formally reinstated by the service on the basis of your transmitted materials, and 3 other parties with corridor transit interests have filed emergency standing requests in the last 2 hours." I put the satchel in the vehicle. She said, "Eshavar Tal has requested a private meeting with the service." I got in the vehicle. Ren followed me in. Pryor closed the door. The vehicle moved. After a moment, Ren said, "How long did you know about the audio?" 4 years and 7 months. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the vehicle's windows, the Commission compound was receding behind us, its glass and stone exterior catching the flat afternoon light. "When did you decide you were going to use it?" "When they voided my accreditation." She thought about that, not before. No. Why not? I had thought about how to answer this question, because it was the question I had known someone would ask, and the accurate answer was not a simple one. The accurate answer had to do with the nature of what the second record was for, with what it meant for documentation to be thorough and patient and held in reserve, and with the specific judgment required to understand the difference between the moment when using it would cause a disruption and the moment when using it would cause a correction. Disruption is easy. It does not require 11 years of careful work. It does not require the discipline of sitting in a gallery with cold coffee while watching a process that is not what it claims to be, and choosing, every day, to keep documenting rather than act. Correction requires the moment to be exactly right. It requires the record to be complete enough that it cannot be dismissed. It requires the audience to be present, and the receiving addresses to be positioned, and the administrative mechanism being used against you to be the specific, narrow mechanism that makes your response not merely a counterargument, but the demonstration that the record itself has already been built. What I said to Ren was shorter than all of that, I said, because I needed them to make the move they were going to make, not a version of it, the actual one. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right," and opened her briefing case. The review process ran for 8 months. I will not describe it at procedural length. The Commission, facing 37 simultaneous recipients of a documented evidentiary record, and 4 new standing challenges from parties with direct interests in the Compact's transit provisions. The Vareth sovereignty had refiled, correctly this time, the moment the documentation was publicly available, did what institutions do when their internal architecture has been made visible from the outside. They managed the exposure with the tools available to them. Herath Vaughn remained as chair, but recused herself from the review process on grounds of a conflict of interest that was, at this point, fairly obviously documented. Eshavar Tal's private meeting with the service produced a conversation that Ren described afterward as cordial and unproductive. The Commission's administrative review of my conduct concluded that I had violated gallery protocol, and that my use of Commission facilities monitoring data was a matter requiring clarification under the transparency provisions, and then, approximately 3 months later, concluded that the use had been within the provision's scope, and then, approximately 2 months after that, said nothing further about it in any document I was made aware of. There were other conversations in those 8 months that I was not party to and am not fully informed about, between the Commission and the non-consulted parties, between the coalition delegations and the Commission Secretariat, between the Earth Diplomatic Services Legal Office and the Commission's Charter Review Body. I know the rough shape of these conversations because I can read institutional behavior, and because I have sources I am not going to identify. What they produced, gradually and without announcement, was a set of understandings about how the review was going to conclude, and what the Compact's revised process was going to look like, and those understandings were reached, as most things in the Commission are reached, in the spaces between the official sessions. Earth's accreditation was reinstated 6 months after the ratification session. The reinstatement was accompanied by a Commission Secretariat communication that described it as the conclusion of the compliance remediation process, without any further characterization. My personal accreditation was reinstated at the same time. The communication was 2 paragraphs long, written in the Commission's standard administrative register, and contained no acknowledgement of the administrative session that had produced the voiding or the circumstances under which it had been conducted. I filed it in the main record under accreditation status, administrative correspondence. I noted the date and the 2-paragraph length. The Anchoret Compact's ratification was suspended for 8 months while the standing challenges were adjudicated. When the Commission returned to the ratification question, the process looked different. 4 delegations with corridor interests that had not been reflected in the original compact's provisions were now seated as full participants. The transit allocation provisions were reopened. The negotiation that followed was neither quick nor comfortable, but it was, by any reasonable measure, a different kind of process than the one that had been planned. Earth's 3 transit claims in the corridor were recognized in full in the revised compact. I was present for the ratification vote. I was sitting in the same seat I had occupied for 11 years, 42 rows back on the north tier, with a thermos of cold coffee. The amber indicator beside the word Earth in the Commission's master registry was active. When the vote was called and the compact ratified in its revised form, I poured a cup, and I drank it, and I wrote the date and the vote tally in my documentation, because that is what I do. Herath Vaughn did not look at me when the vote was read out. Eshavartal did. Briefly, his expression was the same one I had seen in the chamber on the morning of the original session, the quiet expression of someone who has understood that what they believed was private has not, for a significant period, been private at all. There was something in it now that I might have described, in a less careful moment, as a form of acknowledgement. Not respect precisely, something cooler and more specific than respect. The look of a player who has examined, in retrospect, the full sequence of moves that produced a result he had not anticipated, and has reached an accurate assessment of the quality of the play. I noted it and looked away. In the years after the compact, I continued my work at the Commission in the same way I had always conducted it. I kept the second record. I added to it regularly. I continued filing facility usage inquiries and administrative access requests, and observer-standing correspondence in the quiet, periodic rhythm I had developed over the course of my posting. If I was watched more carefully after the compact, and I was certain of it, I was watched by people who now understood what careful meant, and they watched me accordingly. That is a different kind of attention than being ignored. It changes the quality of the work, not the method of it, not the patience it requires, but the texture of the environment in which it is conducted. People in the Commission's corridors knew my name now in the way that people know the name of someone they have reason to remember, rather than someone they have decided not to notice. The third-floor dining facility's northeast corner table had a slightly wider radius of open space around it than it had had before. The Commission's administrative staff processed my access requests with a speed and care that was not the speed and care of an office performing routine functions. There were other changes, subtler but more significant in practical terms. 3 delegations who had never previously acknowledged my observer comments during floor sessions began doing so, not warmly, not with any suggestion of alliance, but with the procedural acknowledgement that indicates a party has decided it is worth their time to be on record as having heard you. The Commission's Compact Deliberation Committee, newly constituted and with a broader membership following the Anchorate Review, began, for the first time in my experience, returning written responses to observer comment requests within the required timeframe. The responses were brief and formulaic, the minimum acknowledgement the rules required. They were also, in 11 years, the first responses I had ever received. The Compact's revised negotiation had produced something else that I had not fully anticipated: a working relationship with the Varith Sovereignties Commission liaison, a careful and precise official named Driveth San, who had been the one who filed the original standing challenge, and who had watched the Compact's collapse and reconstruction with the attention of someone taking thorough notes of their own. Driveth San did not approach me about cooperation, and I did not approach them. What we had was a shared professional habit, a tendency to be in the same corridor spaces at the same times, a quiet mutual awareness of each other's documentation practices, an occasional brief exchange of precisely the kind of information that 2 accredited observers are permitted to exchange with each other under the Commission's transparency provisions. Nothing that required discussion, nothing that required agreement. Just two people who had independently reached the same conclusion about how to work in a room that had been built to exclude them, and who had decided, without saying so, to keep working. These were the costs and also the advantages of having been found out. I cataloged them like everything else. What I know from those years is this. The Commission's charter still says what it has always said about equal standing and mutual recognition. The gap between what the charter says and what it permits in practice has narrowed, though it has not closed. It will probably not close in my lifetime. That is not pessimism. It is an accurate assessment of the pace at which institutions change when the thing driving the change is documentation rather than force. Force is faster. I have thought about force in a general and theoretical way in idle moments. Earth has resources in the Anchorite corridor that the Commission did not include in its original calculations. The Commission knows this now. The revised compact's negotiating process was educational in several directions simultaneously. There were delegates in that process who learned things about Earth's corridor infrastructure that I do not believe they had been told before, and who asked follow-up questions in a register that was not casual. But force terminates the record. It makes everything that came before it secondary, a prelude, a justification, context for the conflict. The record, if you keep it carefully and hold it correctly, does not terminate. It accumulates. It grows specific and cross-referenced and difficult to dismiss. It sits in 37 inboxes at once, and it arrives at exactly the moment the people receiving it needed to arrive, because you have spent 11 years making sure that the moment is the right one. The Commission did not erase Earth. They tried in the only way available to them, the quiet administrative way, the paperwork deficiency way, the retroactive compliance review way. They turned off an amber light and called it a conclusion. They did not know what the amber light meant to them, and what it meant to us were different things. To them, it was the indicator of an observer standing. To us, it was a light we had already been operating without for a long time, a signal in a system we had learned to function independently of, and had been functioning independently of for 11 years, in a second record that they did not know existed and could not reach. When they voted to erase us, we were already somewhere else. We had always been somewhere else. We had been there patiently, methodically, without announcement or grievance, waiting for them to make the one move that would make the second record useful. They made it. They thought the problem was solved. We were never gone.